a pleasure to have you here. You are a go-to guy or the go-to guy to talk about climate and climate policy, which is your specialty. And so why don't you tell me what you're working on right now with this Trump transition, with the new administration coming in? So much is going on. Everybody's hopeful. Everybody's excited. And I want to hear from a climate guy how you're looking at the next 4 years and the next few months.
Well, this is an amazing time for me I've been following the climate issue pretty much since 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit when George H.W. Bush, Republican, went down and signed on to that load of bleep treaty, and the Senate ratified it. And this was when he was running against Bill Clinton. They wanted to appear green, and they got us into this entire mess. From that, we have the UN climate agreements. We have the UN annual climate meetings. We have Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, the whole UN, environmental disaster, which benefits China, which benefits the Middle East, which benefits Venezuela. So it's the most anti-American, outside of our national interest you could ever do. And hey, it was started by a Republican president. So let's be bipartisan here. Okay. Fast forward through all of this. And like you mentioned Trump. I don't know what Bob Dole would have done, but he was establishment. You mentioned George W. Bush. George W. Bush rubber stamped every UN report, verbally supported it, never challenged the science. Sure, we didn't have a climate treaty, but we didn't have one under Clinton either. John McCain was a co-sponsor of these bills. Mitt Romney was as involved as John McCain. He had a lot of Obama's administration officials working for him when he was governor of Massachusetts. So in terms of Republicans, since Ronald Reagan, you basically have Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump that had an America First policy when it came to the UN. Every other Republican president or nominee was a disaster. I hope I don't offend anyone.
No, I'm in a total accord with you, and that's the only person you need to worry about offending is me. No, I'm joking.
Okay.
You won't offend me, no matter what you say.
So when Trump was running in 2015, people were like, "Oh, I can't believe Republican." I'm sorry. So which nominee is Trump worse than? Is he worse than George H.W. Bush? Is he worse than Dole? Is he worse than George W. Bush? Is he worse than McCain, Romney? To me, Donald Trump was the greatest breath of fresh air. He had me going down that escalator in 2015. So he comes in 2016, has a great presidency, especially economically. I think he threw his whole president. The greatest single mistake any president made in 50 years was him signing on to the COVID emergency declaration and empowering Anthony Fauci, the 2 weeks to flatten the curve. We know it was a scam now because Deborah Birx wrote about it. That was ended the day that Donald Trump signed that, the 2 weeks to flatten the curve and the COVID emergency, he ended his presidency. Because that literally, and I write that in my book, The Great Reset, that ended it for him. It tanked the economy. It forced all the regulations to change on the voting, which gives us all the mail-in balloting. And it turned the entire Trump 4 years into just sort of a psyop by the deep state public health bureaus. Anyway, okay. So fast forward to simply answer your question. Sorry, I'm going into way too much history here. Donald Trump did a great job, but he didn't go far enough on anything in his first term relating to climate. He pulled us out of the Paris Agreement. So what? Joe Biden, in the first week, put us back in. Donald Trump is now 8 years later. Donald Trump 2.0 is poised to really be on fire when it comes to climate, energy, and all.
Sorry, I just want to dance every time I get really excited.
Well, here's why. 8 years ago, the establishment, and I was in Marrakesh, Morocco. I've been to 21 out of the last 23 UN climate summits. Just got back from Baku, Azerbaijan. Yes, which to anyone who needs to know, it's borders I keep saying Soviet Union. It borders Russia and Iran. That's where I just came from. 23 hours of nonstop flying,
Armenia
taxi.
Too.
In Armenia, yes. But just for reference, it's Iran and Russia. I always like to tell people because I don't think people know where Armenia is, but at least they have an idea usually where Russia is. Okay. So I get back from, I go to this conference and I can see the difference. I was in Marrakesh 2016. I had a cardboard cutout of Donald Trump. I wore a MAGA hat. I got a paper shredder locally, started shredding the UN Paris Agreement. The UN has no sense of humor, I found out. They immediately sent armed UN climate cops with guns, and me and my associate Craig Rucker were escorted off the UN conference. We were banned for the rest of the week, had our credentials stripped. They came back at me, confiscated my briefcase, took all my papers. because we did this little press conference where we said, you're not going to like this, but Donald Trump's, and everything we said was true, of course. Well, fast forward 8 years, Donald Trump knows now. He's given him, he understands this. He is now looking to submit the UN Climate Paris Agreement as a treaty to the GOP Senate. If he does that, they're obviously going to vote it down. Then it's not so easy for the next Democrat president, or God forbid, a Mitt Romney-style Republican, to come in and resubmit us to that treaty. And this is where I think Donald Trump is learning. He's talking about deeper reform, just reversing executive orders.
Okay, so this is good. This is where I want to go on these kinds of things. So you're saying that the Paris Treaty, did the Senate back in what year, did they actually approve of being in that treaty?
Great question. No, that was done as an executive agreement. It was 2015. I was in Paris, France. This was the United Nations Climate Summit. I believe it was. This is the Obama one, and John Kerry signed a treaty. He brought his granddaughter, and Al Gore. Everyone had said, "We saved the planet, future generations." Guess what? They're not talking like that. Now they're saying there's a climate emergency. So we didn't save the planet. How many times do we have to save the planet? What happened? Why do we have to keep saving it? They did this, and it was an executive agreement. Obama never submitted it to the Senate. Now, the legal argument, which was never tested, was because this was an offshoot, essentially, of the Rio Earth Summit, the Sustainable Development Treaty that George Bush did sign and was approved and ratified on a voice vote by the U.S. Senate back in 1992, that this did not need to be ratified because it was essentially qualified under that treaty's ratification, which is not going to fly. But if Donald Trump, by just pulling us out at the time, remember, he had a lot of bad cabinet kicks, and I might be offending more people.
No, that's
Rick Perry, Energy Secretary, argued for Donald Trump to stay in the UN Paris Agreement.
Who was that?
His secretary, Rick Perry, the governor of Texas.
Oh, my goodness.
No good on this. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State. Not only did he want him to stay in the UN Paris Agreement, one of his first acts as Secretary of State was to go to a UN-sponsored event and sign a UN climate declaration with the Inuit people of the Arctic. Donald Trump had a lot of weak cabinet picks, especially on the not Scott Pruitt at EPA, who was a fantastic. But anyway, okay, moving on. So that's what happened. That's the answer to your question. They didn't have it as a treaty. So if he can get us out of that 1992 treaty, that makes it very hard for the next president to get us back.
I want to find, like, the concrete steps. Of course, there are many great minds. We can see them being trotted out, being nominated, being appointed. And so I have a lot of confidence. I just want to track all of it. I want, during the next 4 years, especially the first two, I want to be tracking. And so I want to know what I'm looking for. I'm assuming, I want to go back to the 92 thing and the treaties for just a moment. I'm assuming day one, I have a list of all the treaties that were ostensibly climate related. By the way, with the climate, not treaties, EOs, executive orders, climate is like DEI. It is forced into every single mold. So you can have the Department of Education, you can have Homeland Security, and all of our foreign policy. So is climate touching basically every department, or virtually every department?
I mean, you are literally, by just asking that question, you just quoted the Biden administration. They've actually said every cabinet agency is a climate agency. The Pentagon, whether it's the Marines, whether it's the Navy, they have all these climate action plans. Politico just wrote a Pete Hegseth nomination to the Pentagon that he could be a national security threat because he doesn't take climate change seriously, which made me ask, is America going to survive not having a climate emergency plan from the United States Pentagon? This is nuts. The Department of Transportation has funded studies under Obama about how fatal car crashes have increased due to climate change. The entire EV mandate of the Department of Transportation is based on the climate scare. We have to get rid of gas-powered cars. The entire Department of Agriculture is now coming after American farmers, saying you can't have high-yield agriculture. We have to start restricting the nitrogen-based fertilizer, and we're coming after meat eating through methane restrictions. Stuff that they've tried in Europe over and over. Of course, you had the Netherlands farmers and the farmers in Europe. They know how to do it. They formed their own political party in the Netherlands. They fought back. They have a seat at the parliament. They halted these ridiculous regulations, which were only going to benefit big corporate agribusiness. Bill Gates, by the way, two of the biggest billionaires, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, are two of the largest single farmland owners in the United States.
And China. China's China.
Third. Here's the question, and this is for you, Elizabeth. Who do you rather own more farmland, China or Bill Gates? It's something you have to think about. You might think a homegrown American like Bill Gates. I think I'd rather China because people would be more likely to oppose them, whereas Bill Gates, he's got a very specific agenda.
That is the hardest question I've been asked in a long time because I literally can't come up with the answer. I will say this. I want small family-owned farms back in the driver's seat. That's middle America. That's the middle class. That's what drives our economy. There's so many things. Let me go back because I want to keep moving forward in what has to be done. So during Trump, was the environment or climate change already in all of the departments? Was it reduced at all during Trump, or what was the ebb and the flow since Obama or even Bush in the pushing of it into the departments across the federal government?
Okay, here's how it went. Obama, all the way over here. Trump, all the way over here. Biden, all the way back here. And now Trump, all the way back here.
How do we inoculate? See, a theme that runs through my mind in every conversation I have is inoculation or building up the ramparts, building that wall. We have to, burn it all down, if you will. It's all very, very graphic language. And then rebuild from the ground up. But we cannot allow this to happen again. This should not be like a forever war that we're never out of. So, Marc, what is your recommendation in the next year to set it in stone so that we can't go back?
Okay. Well, actually, Pete Hegseth has said openly, one of the reasons he's there is to get rid of the woke stuff and the climate stuff. His top two priorities are going to be everything from, transgenderism and the critical race and DEI and climate. I mean, it's all part of that same thing. Every agency under Donald Trump, and they're saying he's modeling his cabinet after FDR, where
kitchen cabinet.
You have someone like, the idea is to have someone like Marco Rubio, who's purely establishment in my book, as Secretary of State, and then Tulsi Gabbard. He wants debate, like he liked having John Bolton because he would go to the Middle East and say, "This is the crazy guy with me. I don't want if you're not careful, I'll unleash." Which is brilliant.
Please, I just don't want to go back there again. But anyway, so what you're saying is he's putting some establishment types and then the radicals like me and you
following his dictates is what I'm saying. So that's I believe the good news here. He's not going to allow the undermining that happened the last time around, and the fact that he's not including Mike Pompeo and others like that, because there's a lot of stories about Mike Pompeo going behind.
Let's go to what is the single greatest thing that will assure that all the gains that we make during this administration, because
very easily.
What is the single and most important step to set in stone that they would have to fight for decades to ever try to get us back to?
All right. Well, yes, I think here, I'm going to read this to you. This is from. I'm with the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. My website's Climate Depot.
Yes.
We work with the Heartland Institute. We work with a couple other groups. Here's what we came up. This is the Paris Climate Agreement. This is the critical thing. This is what's been a mess for 32 years in the United States. If you recall, who recalls this unless you study it? When George H.W. Bush got back from Rio and then lost to Bill Clinton anyway, I can't imagine why he lost. He was all green. He prostrated himself to the UN. You think he would have won. Nancy Pelosi read in the entire United Nations Agenda 21 into the congressional record. They were all excited. But here's how you get out of this. This led to the Paris Agreement. You have to call the Paris Agreement that Obama signed, who he called an executive agreement, you have to declare that a treaty. That will require Senate ratification. You will transmit that treaty from that 2015, the Paris Agreement, which we're living under. This is everything from net zero, the EV mandates, the agricultural restrictions, all the solar and wind mandates. This is the basis for the Inflation Reduction Act. We rubber stamp and accept all this science from the UN. This will legally relieve, once we have the Senate reject this, will legally relieve the U.S. of any and all obligations under this UN Paris Treaty until and unless the Senate formally ratifies it. So remember, if you go back to the Kyoto, which was before, this was 1997, the Senate voted 97-0 against ratifying the Kyoto Protocol because it didn't include China, because it was all these Democrat senators. This is the way you do it. So then once you do that with this thing, that is almost impossible for another president to get us back in, because they have to have a ratified treaty, which is going to require advise and consent of the Senate. The second thing he needs to do is, in 2000, I was working for the Senate Environment Public Works Committee, and Senator Inhofe was the chairman at the time. Well, he was a ranking member. I think this happened, I believe it was 2009, the endangerment finding. The EPA, the Supreme Court ruled that carbon dioxide, we inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide, what could be regulated as a pollutant under the original 1970s Clean Air Act, and was revised in the early 1990s under George H.W. Bush. For the first time in U.S. history, based on the Supreme Court ruling, government, federal agencies were going to be able to regulate carbon dioxide, what humans exhale from our mouth, as a pollutant. Europe has gone further. They said we should regulate carbon dioxide similar to the way we do asbestos. Wait a minute, this is human breath. And it sounds shocking until you realize they wanted to muzzle us during COVID. They weaponized human breath during COVID. Everyone was suspected. You couldn't go see grandma. You were a grandma killer if you didn't wear a mask. So you see where that's going. So if he gets rid of this endangerment finding that the EPA has then done, they've now
That was a
regulated with
rule.
the
Was that a rule, the endangerment finding?
Yes, that was an EPA regulation that we're still living under. And Trump last time, I would argue timidly, did not take that on because they didn't think they were going to win it. But this time they have to take this on. It's probably going to be involved legal. But if we can defeat that, where you say human breath is not.
Yeah, because you know what? Having bad breath is one thing, but having killer breath is another. And I refuse to accept that. So let me ask you this question. Doesn't the Chevron deference, and I can't remember the name of the other Supreme Court ruling, that, or maybe it's only Chevron, that essentially eliminates the ability for the bureaucratic state to create law, call it a rule, and do it because Congress has not satisfactorily elucidated or created the rule itself. They're like a secondary lawmaking.
Yes, that's basically what's happening.
But shouldn't that have something to do with what you're just talking about? This, what is it again?
Yeah, the endangerment finding. And yes, what you're talking about is courts now, whether it's federal district courts, even state courts. They're now writing U.S. laws. And we've been battling with this obviously since Roe v. Wade, to give a classic example, 1973. But they're doing the same thing now with climate. And many times they're using children's lawsuits. We have kids in elementary school being funded now to sue the state of Colorado, the state of Montana, and they're winning these lawsuits. They're suing the European governments. They're winning lawsuits, and then the court can then order oil companies and executives to start paying up. It's like a lot of this is also based on the model of the tobacco settlement, where you sue tobacco companies and try to get a settlement. In other words, they're looking at it and saying, well, this oil company over here, you caused that hurricane in Florida, or you caused that tornado in Tornado Alley. It's completely medieval witchcraft. They're basically saying anyone who has any emissions is causing this bad weather, which, by the way, the UN, our U.S. National Climate Assessment, all admit hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, droughts are a no trend or declining trend on climate timescales.
Absolutely.
There's no there.
There's no science that supports that climate change I believe in climate change, spring, summer, winter, fall.
Yes, exactly.
But
here's the thing, let me just finish the point out real quick. So you have the courts trying to legislate, Aside from that, you have corporations now legislating. And what I mean by that is through ESG, and you mentioned DEI, this corporate government collusion between these activists and administration, they work out. And so they're forcing companies like BlackRock, forcing change. In the words of Larry Fink's own words, we're going to force these on companies, forcing them to go along with the environment, social governance, and all the regulations, ESG. So this is the other area. When Pete Hegseth says the woke stuff, that's what we're talking about. So the fact that public opinion's turned against it, whether it's critical race, whether it's transgender ideology, the climate, this is beautiful. Trump is the right man at the right time. The opportunity's incredible. I would argue that his most controversial nominee is not Pete Hegseth, not Kash Patel, but RFK Jr., who, by the way, has the greatest position on climate change you've ever heard. He's the guy I interviewed in 2014 at a climate march. He went into jail climate deniers and energy CEOs, put him in The Hague with 3 square meals and a cot.
I think they should be enjoying 3 hots and a cot at The Hague with all the other war criminals who are there.
Fast forward, post-COVID, he now says he will not talk about climate change. He is not going to ever bring it up because climate change has been hijacked by the United Nations and the World Economic Forum for totalitarian control of society. Boom! But here's the thing. Watch RFK. You're going to have every medical group, pediatrics. You're going to have farmers' lobbies against him because of all the corn subsidies, which gives you high fructose corn syrup. They've corrupted American farmers. With the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden is spending, I think it's $100 million, pumping it in. A lot of it's going to farmers so that he has a ready-made constituency that won't want to see these subsidies cut.
Can we, this is a side note here, but I have been horrified, as most Americans are, that he is spending billions, giving them to NGOs, nonprofits that some have even just started. Can you imagine starting a nonprofit and the federal government gives you $900 million or $2.3 billion?
That happened under Obama on a much smaller scale. Inflation Reduction Act only sent $370 billion. It was approved. They're now up to spending $2 trillion.
I know you're not an attorney, but have you ever seen, because there's so much power in that America uses in banking. They debank people. They sanction individuals in Israel who live in Judea and Samaria, and they literally end their banking. Is there any way that on day one, Donald J. Trump can sign an executive order or institute some sort of a policy where they go after these NGOs and take that money back because it was illegitimate under false pretenses? I mean, imagine the money that has been squandered and frittered away. And
well, I don't know. And I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. Okay. You're talking to someone, I was a volunteer, very young, a teenager, at 1980 Ronald Reagan's campaign. And I actually followed Milton Friedman economics. I was always limited government. I was all excited. David Stockman, Ronald Reagan, first term. Read David Stockman's book, which I think he wrote by mid-'80s or maybe a little later. You know, it was almost the most impossible thing in the world to reduce spending. So you're asking if we can get a refund. I'm saying we're lucky to even repeal and stop the current spending and the future spending plan. Why? Whole coalition of establishment GOP House members are saying they don't want to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, or maybe just parts of it. Why? Because the Biden administration, and you got to give them credit for this, this is as old as the hills, they targeted, and that's where this money's going now, targeted all these different constituencies, from automakers to farmers to Republican House members, especially in vulnerable districts, to pump this money in. You're getting a Chinese EV plant going to be coming to some small town in North Carolina. Who wants to turn down billions of dollars of taxpayer money? What congressman's going to vote against that? That's the problem here. I think it's a 50-50 bet at best that we even repeal this under Donald Trump and the Republican Congress. That's how hard it is to shrink government. So the idea of getting a refund for money already spent, not going to happen. Sorry to burst your bubble there, Elizabeth.
I was going to go into some of the appointees and nominees, but I don't even think I want to go there right now. This omnibus spending, do you agree or disagree that President Trump should essentially say to Congress, if you send me any omnibus or continuing resolutions, it's no, and that every single bill has to be subject specific, single subject, and it has to, I say that it should be able to be read by one person in one day,
Yeah.
or a couple of hours. And so if is that one way to inoculate this? Could we ever get Congress even to agree that all bills have to be single subject so that they can't sneak things in?
I guess the implication of what you're saying is, well, we have a government shutdown, and that's never really gone that well for people trying to cut the budget, Republican presidents who've tried it. I don't know. It's not really I don't have an expertise in how you go about this. I will say this. It's the most exciting time since David Stockman was at Office of Management and Budget in the early 80s to have Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk coming in, Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency. But I think they're in for the, I don't think, it's the same thing that happens to a lot of CEOs when they go into government. They realize they have very little control.
Okay, what about this? If it's hard to
bubbles, but go ahead.
It's hard to fire people, and that's got to be changed. But if you eviscerate many programs, like, for instance, DEI is in everything. All DEI is taken out. Therefore, you have to lose those individuals because you don't have any jobs anymore. They're layoffs. And with regard to climate, they are spread around this country. If we shut down programs, then we also eliminate people working in those programs. But then what agencies would you attempt, or would you be in favor of shutting the doors, like the Department of Education? I pray that goes, just very, very quickly. Yeah. That's a prayer. But what would you shut down? Close the door, shutter it.
I just think, again.
Oh, you're so negative, Mark.
I'm so guilted. I mean, I had Ronald Reagan. Let's still close the Department of
Reagan. I loved Ronald Reagan when
every Republican nominee.
He was but he's no Donald Trump, and he doesn't. America was not ready and didn't understand. So go ahead.
I guess to answer your question directly, if you go to shut down agencies, that's a whole different argument than radically scaling them back. And obviously they can be refunded in the future. I think if you try to shut them down, it's going to be dead on arrival. Remember, in 2017, Donald Trump had a great budget that was like cutting the EPA budget in half. It was dead on arrival with the Republican Congress. Donald Trump himself was never a big deficit hawk or limited spender. I hate to say that. He really wasn't. I would just go after the spending. I would use that. I don't think they're going to actually be able to abolish any agency. If they were to do one, I think Department of Education would be the closest. And I think you could scale back, particularly Department of Interior, when you have entire Western states that are, 30, 40% owned by the federal government. It's not an argument about, we're going to preserve these lands. It's not allowing state and local governments control of their own land. And by the way,
that's a big thing for me when you look at a map of the United States and you see how much of the West is owned by the federal government. Can you see selling off 20, 30% or 50% of that land? I'm not talking about Mount Zion National Park or something like that. We want our national monuments. That's fine. But all the rest of that land, can we sell it off instead of leasing it? Why not sell it off to pay off part of the debt?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it could possibly default or even go transfer to state governments. I would still rather Utah own that land than the federal government. You want it as close as possible, and then Utah could decide how to divvy that up or sell it back. I don't know about how the problem with that is, and here's my greatest fear, is who would end up buying the land? Would it be the highest bidder? Would Bill Gates? Would BlackRock? Who's going to own all that land? You get into a whole because who controls that process? It's going to be corporate government collusion. So you have to.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
For in that situation. So I don't even know that they're going to even try to shut any agencies down. I think we just have to scale back. We have to show it's possible. The greatest success we can have, massive spending restraint. And if we can have massive economic growth with a thriving middle class and low inflation and a return to stable and low energy prices and food prices, then everyone's going to realize government doesn't need to be that big. Because remember, we're still a divided nation. Look at Congress, look at the presidential vote. It's still very close. I just don't think there's an appetite to start abolishing. And if we were going to do anything, I would kick the UN out of the US, move the UN to Brussels, and we could just be a part of it as a sort of a clown show and not be hosting it anymore.
I agree with you. Is that taken very seriously, do you know, by the Trump administration? Because I don't know with Israel, because I am a Zionist, Christian Zionist, and with Israel, we can't leave the UN because of Israel.
Not give them that.
Right, I know. So my thought, and I know other people think the same thing, is that we just say basically, your time is up, go away, go to Brussels. And do you think that would have a significant effect on the UN in the sense that its pride of place and its stature? Here it is in New York City.
It would put it in its proper context. Americans would see it as this globalist institution in Europe that that has a lot of bad ideas on a lot of different things. Instead of, this is this esteemed great. I mean, if you look at old movies, whether it's, they always made the UN appear like this big august council of wise men, and they're
it
goes
seemed
back
like that in 48, 49, 50 as they were developing that. It just seemed, and it was before the third world changed the complexion. I don't mean complexion in terms of color.
Right.
Sorry, wrong word. But it changed the dynamics because the third world is essentially running the UN. Well, I wonder about your thinking about these agencies that relate to climate more significantly, like the EPA and the Agriculture, Department of Agriculture, Energy Secretary. Do you believe that it's of massive importance for those offices to be shut down here in D.C.? Are you in the Northern Virginia area or Maryland?
Yeah, I live outside of D.C. in Northern Virginia in the suburbs, yes.
We're neighbors. Don't you agree, like many and myself, that we should be moving these agencies out to the hinterlands or to the flyover country? Which ones would you move?
I've heard of this proposal. The only problem is, and you're talking. I guess the word is cynical, but here's the problem. It's kind of like people who talk about a national sales tax, but not abolishing the income tax. Well, we'll put a flat 10% IRS and we'll add a national sales tax. No, because at the end of the day, if you're thinking like someone who studied government's going to have two taxes now. They can always raise the income tax, and now they have a national sales tax. The problem with moving, whether it's EPA or FBI, out to another location, and we see this with what Robert Byrd did with the FBI. West Virginia has these highways to nowhere, bridges to nowhere. It's all these big, giant complexes. And they end up with like multiple, tentacles growing because then they're going to be two separate constituencies. Even if you radically cut back, I don't think they're going to eliminate a presence of any agency in D.C. I don't know. I think that's almost more symbolic, and I'm not necessarily opposed to it. But
Trump did it in his first administration, and Biden didn't 100% claw it back. And I think that we need to figure out a way to get them out of D.C. because what is the Department of Agriculture? I saw some schmo, senator or congressperson say, well, we have farming in Maryland or something. I'm thinking, that is not the point. D.C., Northern Virginia is all about spending money. It is. I mean, if we move them all out, the value of my home goes down. I'm willing to sacrifice for my country. I want them all living in Iowa, throw some in Montana, Idaho, whatever. Just get them out of D.C. I'm not sure. We already said that we can't do that. My notes.
I don't expect that to shrink the size in the end, is all I'm saying. But it may not be a bad idea.
Well, a lot of people will quit because it was about like 3/4 of employees or more quit because they didn't want to leave Georgetown and their cocktail parties and their life. What about Elise Stefanik? I love her because she's just such a she-bear. How much of a role does the ambassador to the UN play when it comes to these treaties and all these machinations having to do with?
Huge. I mean, I think wasn't it, first of all, just the history of that, wasn't it? I'm thinking of Jeane Kirkpatrick, Alan Keyes, the importance of these for narrative, whether it's foreign policy, Israeli policy, climate policy. This is what's needed the most. And what I mean by that, I'm going to Viktor Orban, a lot of conservatives, he's, as far as I can see, he's a very good leader of Hungary. Probably he spoke at the UN climate summit, and he still was like, oh, it's important and net zero. He was capitulating to their narrative. I was kind of stunned. I'm like, why is he doing that? It doesn't make any sense. And here's the thing. So if you have a UN ambassador, you have to do it right. And Nikki Haley, I don't think, did it right on climate. Nikki Haley is in on this.
Fine on Israel, but she had a grating voice, so I didn't even like that much. But Stefanik is going to nail it, I think.
Yes. The most important thing for her to do on these issues of climate, and she has to reframe the narrative. And I don't mean it has to be complex stuff. It could be stuff like the UN is claiming XYZ. This treaty, according to all analysis, wouldn't even impact temperature if you believed what the UN was claiming. This is a complete virtue signaling nonsense. I mean, that's what they need. They need to go at the heart of it. Net zero is Soviet-style control. The U.S. rejects it. We urge our European allies to reject it. We urge people all over the world. That kind of talk from a UN ambassador, I don't think has been done on climate ever. And that's what I would welcome.
So that is, to me, I think that's one of the most valuable ideas that we've discussed here. And that is that Stefanik and any other that speaks for us on the international stage is nailing it. They're calling a spade a spade. They're saying, like you just said, this net zero, it's essentially a joke. It's a mirage. It's
redo is
it's
what it
the
is.
Soviet style redistribution of wealth, elimination of private property, go after World Economic Forum and all the rest of them, but really nail it to the wall. And so will you be posting some notes for Elise for the coming 4 years in X?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. In fact, the UN, and I would like to actually go to New York when she's up there if she's dealing with anything specifically climate related, because we need to grab the narrative and we need to grab the upper hand on this. I mean, even again, I hate to say this, Trump 1.0 really did, other than his EPA secretary, Scott Pruitt, not a single cabinet member would challenge the premise of anything. In fact, most of them ran scared of this issue. And I'm hoping that this is completely different this time. I will say that New York's Lee Zeldin of the EPA, he was part of this Republican Climate Caucus, and he was on one of these, one of these groups. And he was he's from New York, so you can give him a little bit of a pass, but he did virtue signal to the rhetoric of it. But I don't think that's going to matter for what he's there to do. But it would be nice if he would, come out boldly and speak. I don't expect that from him, unfortunately, on that, specifically on reframing the narrative. But there's a lot of other, I'm looking forward to particularly his energy secretary, and his Department of Transportation is none other than Sean Duffy. And, Department of Transportation is huge. That is one of the number one. That's what's trying to destroy the gas-powered cars in America with these EV mandates. If we can undo that, and it's so pathetic that the automakers are making so much money. You have a foreign-owned company like Stellantis take billions from taxpayers for these plants, take the money, and then they don't even set up the plants. They cancel it, pocket the money. That's why you have a letter from all these automakers begging Donald Trump to keep the EV mandate and subsidies coming because they want the money from our taxpayers. Of course, Trump will ignore that. But I'm looking forward to Sean Duffy at Department of Transportation to just dismantle all the bull bleep that Pete Hegseth Mayor Pete put together as Biden's Secretary of State. Secretary of Transportation.
Well, I agree with you. I'm a little worried about Lee Zeldin virtue signaling about climate change.
Let's give him a break. That was like 2018 or something.
Well, let's face it. It takes a while to fully understand the enormity, the complexity, the breadth and the depth. And I mean, I started this journey 30, 40 years ago, right? So... and to have Donald Trump or Lee Zeldin or anybody who's a little bit late to the game to fully absorb it. But now he's got really good advisors, and I think that's going to serve.
I don't want to be unfair because J.D. Vance said similar things as early as 2019. So I don't want to, I'm not saying, I would say in our lifetime, the biggest red pill moment for most Americans, and that was going to make Donald Trump 2.0, had to be the COVID lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, mask mandates, stay-at-home orders, the most consequential decision of our life made without an ounce of democracy under emergency decree. All these people who praised China's one-party rule for decades suddenly had the once free West acting like one-party rule China. You couldn't leave your home. You couldn't go to school. Weddings and funerals canceled. Medical procedures canceled. They were talking about bans on interstate travel. You were forced medicine into your body if you wanted to be a citizen. This is what they praised. That's why they love that so much. This has red-pilled so many Americans. This is what red-pilled RFK Jr.
And the border. These are the two things that is the paradigm shift, the COVID border paradigm shift. And I think that's
adding stuff. But yeah, wokeness as well. The transgender.
Well, yeah. Okay. Transgender agenda. That is, those are like the three-legged stool of the woke agenda, or whatever, the deep state agenda. And I think that those are the three things that really changed the way, because they went too far, too fast. See, they didn't do it. Normally they go a little slower and they get away with more, and then they just keep building. And they were very, very, very stupid. And I see God behind it. I think God hardened the heart of these people to make foolish decisions, because nobody smart would have done those three things the way they did that way. Because now it's like it's over, Mark. I would tell you that I think it's more than 50% of America is on the side. I know that there was, I believe that with the California elections, for instance, I'll give you an example. I know that there's election fraud rampant in the state of California. So they're throwing Republicans out because they are literally, their system there is pro-election fraud. And so I think that if they come in, the Trump administration, and have as a top priority a national restoration of free and fair elections, and literally force states to adhere to election integrity, the real kind. I think California would have lost many more seats this time. So I think it tells us there's more people there. It's just that we don't see it because of election fraud.
Yeah, that, and also California has a mass exodus. They're all leaving for other states. So all the red voters who would stay would have left as well. That's going to be a whole nother battle, by the way, that Trump has with California. Gavin Newsom, it's this thing called the California waiver. We dealt with it when I worked in the U.S. Senate Environment Committee. And the idea is whatever California mandates, you live in Virginia, I live in Virginia, it's going to be, we have to follow. Virginia has an EV mandate that our own governor can't get rid of because the previous Democrat governor put in place. So Gavin Newsom wants to protect that foothold. EV mandate's a classic example of how it's Chinese one-party rule. Gavin Newsom has a state executive order mandating EVs and starting phasing out gas-powered cars. Unelected bureaucrats, California Air Resources Board rubber stamps it. The 18 states, including Virginia and New York and Connecticut and Washington, all these other states, join in. Then the EPA, unelected bureaucrats do it. In fact, I did surveys. I couldn't find anywhere in the globe that had a direct vote of anyone voting to start banning gas-powered. That's how they make it happen. And then you have banks saying we're not going to give out car loans for people who do gas-powered cars. You have the World Bank president, former president Nicholas Stern at a World Bank meeting saying automakers aren't going to get funded if they continue to make gas-powered cars. You have cities in Colorado and California banning the creation of new gas stations. So if you own a gas-powered car, you won't be able to get gas for it. This is where I'm saying no one voted on anything I just said, but yet it's happening. And they're doing the same thing with meat. The methane restrictions coming from the EPA. Suddenly meat's going to be rare and expensive. At the same time, they're pushing the bugs on us. At the same time, they're pushing lab-grown meat, which is grown in a petri dish, festered from stem cells from a cow, sheep, or pig, mixed with fetal blood, grown into a steel vat, allowed to fester, and then it's mixed with all these additives. Looks like the pink slime you see with chicken, with the McDonald's chicken nuggets. Then it's printed on a 3D printer with all kinds of dyes, additives to make it look like meat. Now, it's technically meat because it's derived from meat, but it's Franken meat, and hopefully people like RFK will stop that. But that's the kind of
Whenever
and
you
vote.
describe the meat, that Franken meat, it just, I can't tell you how nauseating it is. And I'm just glad you mentioned this one thing because I wouldn't touch it anyway. But you're saying they actually put blood back in the meat. So,
It's the stem cells with fetal blood. So it's done in like a petri dish, and then the petri dish is gone in a steel vat. Yeah, you can watch videos of this, and I have them at my website, Climate Depot. I mean, and they brag about it because it's all like, oh, this is new technology. But this is part of their fear of that is the cancer cells. The idea is they're reproducing rapidly in these steel vats.
well, it's just like the COVID vax, so-called
Yeah.
vax, the mRNA.
Yes.
We'll find out what's in this stuff after 10 or 20 years, and maybe then we'll do an analysis of it. So one last thought I have is this. As a preventative, because I'm all about this idea of prevention of the future, can we have a treaty of several states that we know are against this climate regime, the climate mafia, like say Argentina and a few other states, and actually, instead of saying, no, we're not going to be part of this Paris, which we have to say that, but in addition, we're going to have a treaty that we agree to with various states that are rejecting this idea of the totalitarian state reached by climate change and or climate change policy. Has anyone ever talked about doing that? Like a G7, but it's a C7 or I mean, just something else.
A Western OPEC, in other words, kind of like all the countries that say we're gonna be loud and proud with fossil fuels, and we're gonna band together, and we're gonna have free and open trade on these fossil fuels, and we're gonna preach pro-development, and we're not gonna allow net zero ideology. I like it. The problem is just a paucity of nations that would join.
I only need two. Okay, I only need two for my proposal.
Argentina, the two most likely.
Maybe Poland.
At some point, and maybe Poland, maybe Czech Republic, maybe Hungary. Eastern Europe is I testified to the Polish Parliament back in June. They are unbelievable. My opening line was essentially, Poland suffered under Nazi Germany and under Soviet control for decades. They finally free themselves from the yoke of totalitarianism, and what happens? The West starts imposing net zero ideology, which is a redux of Soviet-style control. And it's kind of like the Tom Cruise movie with I can't remember about the talent agent. You had me at hello. Well, they had me when I talked about their history in Soviet-style control. That's how they view it. So the whole Eastern Bloc sees net zero and the climate crusade for what it is: a intended controlled demolition of energy, freedom of movement, and food, plentiful food supply, and to make rationing, to put global elites in charge, to force you to eat bugs, to force you to stay at home, to force you into 15-minute cities, and to force you to have deprivation and very limited energy. They want to create these crises so that, and make you feel like you're fighting climate change when nothing's changed. And since 1992, when we got into this, carbon dioxide has continued to rise. Doesn't matter what president you voted for. Doesn't matter how many UN treaties. Carbon dioxide is one of hundreds of factors that control the climate. Humans exhale it from our mouth. It is scientific nonsense to say it's the control knob. There are all these other factors. And so the idea is there's no extreme weather on climate timescales. The whole thing is a con. The whole thing is designed for a great reset, which is what this has been all about, which is crushing the middle class, transfer of wealth from poor and middle class to the wealthy, which we saw during COVID lockdowns. That's what the green agenda does. That's what carbon capture is. Republican senators love that. By the way, I hate to be a naysayer again, but Doug Burgum at Interior is a big proponent of not fighting net zero and accepting the premise and carbon capture. He's now changing, he says we'll meet net zero with carbon capture.
No. Can you have coffee with him? We need to talk to
Already
this.
have people reaching out. He's going to be following Trump's edicts. Again, it's to give him a break. And some. By the way, he also was a former executive friend of Bill Gates. Praised Bill Gates. He's a Microsoft executive.
I knew I didn't want him to be the VP pick. I was praying at our table, praying for JD Vance, and now I know why even more so.
I did tweet after tweet for years about Doug Burgum. Just not that he's a bad guy, but just
you don't have to be a bad guy to believe stupid stuff.
Yes.
Right.
But it's make it hard. This is what I'm saying. Farmers, Republican congressmen, governors who get all this money for their own state and constituents, you're saying no to that. You're saying no to billions in carbon capture. You're saying no to billions in climate funding from the Inflation Reduction Act for your farmers. That's how government expands. They know, and that's what the Biden administration was masters of it. They're masters.
It's a formula.
Right now.
Yeah.
A million just went out.
They are truly, you do have to give them credit for being diabolical and the best at evil and perversion of truth and justice possible. Well, I think we should have a future conversation about putting together a summit of leaders, MAGA-style leaders, like make Argentina great again and make Poland great again, and get these leaders together, maybe on U.S. soil, and talk about a treaty organization that will harden, again, I keep going to this, harden it so that if Dems ever get back in, God forbid, if they ever get back in, then they have to overturn something that we did in a treaty instead of us always being in that position. Mark, if I were ever sleepy, I'd call you and just say, hey, can you wake me up? Because if anybody could get me awake, I'm going to go have another Red Bull. No, I'm joking. So, listen, it's been a joy.
I'm not one of these rah guys. Everything's solved. I've lived through it all in terms since Reagan, and I see the flaws in what he failed to do in terms of the spending and restraint. So I don't, and I've seen so many Republican presidents talk about abolishing the Department of Energy. I'm mad at Eisenhower because he had a chance to really scale back the welfare state and government, and he chose not to and expand it back in the 50s. Every part of our history, Republican Congress and Ronald Reagan's first term, that's what this moment is akin to. More than and of course Trump's first term, but I think he did not do that great on spending restraint at all first term, not even close. But I think this is a moment, and I think the first year is going to be critical. First 6 months are going to be critical, and I think he's got a lot of great people. My most excited again, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy on spending. You got and RFK Jr. at health. That's to me that's the biggest. And Hegseth, and I love the Department of Transportation. And I think these other agencies will have to toe the line anyway, even if they're not my first picks, whether it's Zeldin or Burgum.
Would you be wanting, or would you be willing to get back into the federal government game and maybe take a position in the White House and the administration?
I would be open to, listening to what they have. There's been talk of a climate committee, which would be the first during Trump's first term. And I was well positioned. I was working with all the scientists. This was going to be a committee of Nobel Prize winning former United Nations scientists doing a counter report for the first time ever since the UN got involved in this climate science mess, the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel. They started it. There's been no official pushback by any government report anywhere in the world. This would have been under Donald Trump. I'm going to say another name, Bubbles. Larry Kudlow, the Fox Business host, bragged to me at a CPAC that he killed that whole movement.
Why? I love Larry. Wait a minute. I love Larry Kudlow.
He's telling you that's what he told me, and I think he would brag about it today. He thought it was too radical, and he told Trump, "Well, we'll wait till after the election." It never happened. Donald Trump approved it. I talked to Will Happer, who was on it, and Will Happer said it was approved. Donald Trump came back and said, "I thought I approved that." They said, "Oh, well, the staff slow walked it." They said, "We'll do it in your second term." There was no second term. We had Will Happer, the foremost expert, is a Princeton physicist, 200 peer-reviewed studies, foremost expert on greenhouse gases. He went personally sacrificed to serve Trump as his science advisor to do this whole committee and his red team, blue team on climate science. Never happened. If that were to happen again, I would particularly love to be involved.
What is his name? Because you talk so fast, sometimes I miss names, okay? Which is okay.
Will Happer, Happer, Princeton physicist. He was Trump's science advisor in the first term. He's now over 80, so I don't know who his willingness is. He lives up at Princeton, so I don't know if his willingness to come back and try this again. But that would be the kind of thing. Imagine a U.S. government report with, and I've traveled with John Clauser. We spoke at a conference. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist who just won in 2022. He was invited to the White House. He told President Biden he was skeptical of climate change. Biden said, "You're practicing right-wing science." And then the International Monetary Fund canceled a speech by the Nobel Prize winner in physics because he expressed skepticism of climate. Anyway, these are the kind of people that would be involved in this pushback against the UN reports. That's narrative change. To me, the message is how you get things done, not nitty-gritty details important and having the right guy at the agency. But unless you get the public and the agencies and everything back, I think that's how we killed wokeness. That's how we're killing the whole climate scare. You have to change the narrative. And I think that's where
people have to be out there talking about it, especially Trump's cabinet members, especially people like Vivek, and that are so eloquent and so well spoken about these things and really understand it. And they need to be sort of like, remember Jimmy Carter's fireside chats?
Yes.
But not with the cardigan and doing the fireside chat. But in other words, speaking directly to the people, not at a press conference, but really connecting with them and proving to them the things that we need them to know. And that's climate change is a hoax, or,